I raised my champagne to celebrate our 7-year anniversary on a glamorous Chicago rooftop when my sister snatched the microphone, proudly declaring she was pregnant with my husband's child. She smirked, expecting me to collapse in humiliation before 400 guests. She had no idea. The man in the black suit nearby was the private investigator I hired 3 months ago, holding a file ready to destroy her delusions. Hello, dear listeners of Violet Revenge Stories, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with no budget to operate. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our staff to cover their living expenses and continue creating stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or comments of this video. My name is Brooklyn Rivera, and this is the story of how my picture-perfect life shattered. The crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom cast a warm, golden glow over 400 of Chicago's most elite residents. It was our 7-year wedding anniversary, a milestone that demanded nothing less than a 5-star hotel situated in the absolute heart of downtown. Waiters in pristine white jackets circulated smoothly among the city's top architects, real estate moguls, and venture capitalists, carrying heavy silver trays of imported champagne and delicate canapes. The air was thick with the scent of thousands of white roses, flown in fresh just that morning, and the soft, elegant melodies of a live string quartet playing in the corner. From the outside, the entire scene was the very definition of a modern fairy tale. It was a monument to success, a testament to the beautiful life my husband and I had built together. I stood confidently on the grand stage, draped in a custom emerald silk gown that cascaded gracefully down to the polished marble floor. Beside me stood Julian Harper, the man I had loved for nearly a decade, the man everyone believed to be the absolute pinnacle of a perfect husband. He looked dashing in his tailored midnight blue tuxedo, his hand resting securely on the small of my back, projecting the image of a fiercely loyal partner. The master of ceremonies had just finished a glowing tribute to our marriage and our joint business endeavors. As he handed the spotlight over to us, the entire ballroom erupted into a deafening roar of applause. 400 pairs of eyes looked up at us with a mixture of admiration, respect, and perhaps a touch of envy. It was supposed to be the crowning achievement of my personal and professional life, but the thundering applause was suddenly cut short by the sharp, echoing click of high heels marching aggressively across the hardwood floor. Out of the sea of elegantly dressed guests emerged my own biological sister, Chloe Rivera. She was wearing a stunning, form-fitting crimson dress that seemed deliberately chosen to draw every single eye in the room toward her. Before the security guards or the event coordinators could even register what was happening, Chloe effortlessly bypassed the velvet ropes and strode directly up the velvet-lined stairs of the stage. She did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She marched right past Julian, lunged forward, and forcefully snatched the microphone directly out of the bewildered master of ceremonies' hands. A sharp screech of audio feedback pierced the room, causing several guests in the front rows to wince. The elegant string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The low hum of sophisticated chatter died instantly. Chloe stood at the center of the stage, her chest heaving with dramatic flair, holding the microphone tightly. She swept her gaze across the sea of frozen faces, drinking in the sudden attention. Then, with a voice perfectly pitched to carry to the very back of the cavernous ballroom, she delivered her devastating blow. "I am so sorry to interrupt this beautiful charade," Chloe announced clearly, "but there is something all of you need to know. I am pregnant, and the baby growing inside of me is Julian's. So, Brooklyn, I think it is time you step aside and let him be with the woman who is actually giving him a real family." The silence that followed her declaration was absolute and entirely suffocating. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the enormous room. Not a single crystal glass clinked. Not a single person dared to take a breath. I slowly turned my head to look at Julian. The charming, confident flush on his cheeks had completely drained away, leaving his face the color of wet ash. He looked absolutely terrified, his jaw slack, his eyes darting frantically looking for an escape route that did not exist. Down in the front row, the devastating shockwave hit our families. My parents and Julian's parents stood frozen in place like statues, their faces contorted in pure, unadulterated horror, entirely unable to comprehend the catastrophic scene unfolding right before their eyes. Chloe slowly pivoted to face me. A cruel, triumphant smirk stretched across her heavily painted lips. She stared directly into my eyes, her entire posture radiating a toxic mix of arrogance and victory. She was standing there in her crimson dress, waiting for the dramatic collapse she had undoubtedly pictured in her head 1,000 times. She fully expected me to scream, to break down into hysterical sobs, to humiliate myself, and to beg for answers in front of 400 of the most powerful people in the city of Chicago. But my heart had already been broken, processed, and sealed away in a vault of pure ice over the past 90 days. I did not shed a single tear. My breathing remained perfectly steady. I simply looked at my sister, let a serene, knowing smile touch the corners of my mouth, and calmly reached my hand out to take the microphone back. To understand how I could stand on that stage with a smile while my sister declared she was carrying my husband's child. You have to understand exactly who I am. I am 34 years old, and I do not operate on raw, unbridled emotion. I am a senior executive at Aetherius Capital, one of the most ruthless investment firms in the city. Every single day, I sit across polished mahogany tables from men who would gladly bankrupt a small company to add another zero to their offshore bank accounts. I dissect financial portfolios. I negotiate mergers worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and I dismantle corporate lies for a living. In my world, cold logic always reigns supreme. There is absolutely no room for hysterics, and there is certainly no room for blind trust. I apply that exact same clinical precision to my personal life. My sister, Chloe, was built from an entirely different cloth. From the moment she could walk and talk, she existed in a perpetual state of quiet, burning envy. Growing up, whatever I possessed, she suddenly decided she desperately needed. If I saved my allowance to buy a specific dress, she would steal it from my closet and ruin it. If our parents praised me for bringing home top grades, she would immediately throw a spectacular tantrum to drag their attention back to her. It was a pathetic, exhausting cycle. But as we grew older, her petty jealousy morphed into a dangerous sense of entitlement. She honestly believed that the universe owed her my level of success. Despite the fact that she possessed absolutely none of my discipline or work ethic, she wanted the penthouse view without ever having to climb the stairs. Then there was Julian, to the outside world, and even to me for a very long time. He was the picture of a supportive partner. He was a highly talented architect, designing striking glass and steel structures that reshaped the city skyline. But beneath that polished, charming exterior lay a fragile ego that constantly demanded validation. Julian did not just want to be loved. He needed to be worshipped. He craved a specific brand of blind, uncritical adoration that I simply could not provide. When you are managing international hedge funds and working 80 hours a week, you do not have the time or the energy to constantly stroke a grown man's ego. I gave him respect, partnership, and loyalty. But for a man deeply insecure about standing in his wife's shadow, that was never quite enough. That fatal flaw in our marriage created the perfect, gaping opening for Chloe. 2 years ago, she moved to Chicago with no job, no savings, and a mountain of credit card debt. Because I am fundamentally loyal to my blood, I took her in. I paid the rent for her upscale apartment. I covered her daily living expenses, and I foolishly welcomed her into my home. I thought I was helping my younger sister find her footing. Instead, I had invited a parasite into my sanctuary. Chloe quickly realized what Julian lacked, and she weaponized it. She began showering him with the cheap, sycophantic flattery he so desperately craved. She would marvel at his blueprints, like he was a singular genius, hang on to his every word during dinner conversations, and constantly tell him how underappreciated he was. She fed his starving ego, and he greedily swallowed every single bite. The signs of their betrayal did not arrive like a sudden thunderstorm. They crept in slowly, like a subtle toxic mold spreading behind the walls. It started with the scent. I got into Julian's car one Tuesday evening and noticed a lingering, overly sweet floral perfume clinging to the leather upholstery. It was a scent I recognized immediately because I had bought that exact bottle for Chloe's birthday last year. When I casually asked him about it, he smoothly claimed he had given her a ride to a job interview. Then came the sudden shift in his phone habits. A man who used to leave his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter suddenly treated the device like highly classified government property. He would flip it face down the moment I walked into the room. I noticed the hastily deleted message threads. I observed the lingering, secretive glances they exchanged across my dining table during Sunday brunches, the way they stood just an inch too close when they thought I was not looking. They honestly thought they were being clever. They believed they were pulling off the perfect deception right under the nose of the busy, oblivious corporate wife. But they severely underestimated the instincts of a woman who makes a living hunting down anomalies. My intuition, sharpened by a decade on the brutal corporate battlefield, began sounding alarms that I could not ignore. The math of my own marriage was no longer adding up. The discrepancies in his schedules, the unexplained withdrawals from our joint accounts, the sudden defensive anger whenever I asked a simple question. It all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. A cruel, calculated betrayal was taking place right under my own roof, funded by my own money, orchestrated by the two people I was supposed to trust the most in this world. But I did not panic, and I did not confront them. A smart investor never reveals her hand until she knows exactly what cards the opposition is holding. I needed a professional who operated entirely in the shadows. I did not want a standard, run-of-the-mill divorce investigator who would simply tail a vehicle for a few hours and snap a few blurry photographs. I required an absolute ghost, someone who understood the incredibly high stakes of corporate and personal warfare. Through a highly discreet contact in the private security sector, I found Vance Sterling. Vance was a former military intelligence operative who had seamlessly transitioned into the highly lucrative, highly secretive world of fixing massive problems for Chicago's elite. He was incredibly expensive, ruthlessly efficient, and profoundly discreet. Our very first meeting took place in an unmarked, dimly lit office building near the industrial district. I slid a heavy manila envelope across the cold steel table. It contained their names, their suspected locations, and a retainer fee of $50,000 in unmarked cash. I gave him a single, explicit instruction: find every single thing there is to find. For the next 90 days, Vance became the invisible, inescapable shadow haunting Julian and Chloe. His methodology was chillingly thorough, mirroring the exact analytical rigor I applied to my corporate acquisitions. He did not merely follow them down the street. He entirely dismantled their digital and physical existence. While I sat in glass-walled boardrooms, negotiating corporate mergers worth millions, Vance was quietly pulling credit card transaction histories hidden deep beneath shell accounts that Julian arrogantly thought I did not know about. While I was smiling across the dinner table and asking my husband about his day, Vance was extracting security camera data from secluded, low-budget hotels located 50 miles outside the city limits. He meticulously cataloged burner phone communications, tracked GPS coordinates from the navigation systems in their vehicles, and mapped out a precise timeline of their betrayal with the clinical precision of a forensic auditor building a massive racketeering case. They were incredibly sloppy, but they were also arrogant enough to believe their sloppiness was entirely invisible to me. The absolute confirmation of their treachery arrived on a rainy Thursday evening. Vance sent a heavily encrypted file directly to my private, secure server. Up until that exact moment, a tiny, irrational, desperately pathetic part of my brain had still hoped that I was somehow wrong. I hoped my sharp intuition was just paranoia fueled by severe exhaustion and work stress. But the very first image that loaded on the screen brutally slaughtered that pathetic little hope. It was a high-resolution photograph, taken in the dimly lit parking lot of a cheap, decrepit motel near the interstate. The resolution was crystal clear. It showed Julian, the man who had solemnly sworn to protect and cherish me until the end of his days, pinning my own sister against the passenger side of his luxury sedan. Their hands were tangled intensely in each other's hair, their mouths locked in a desperate, passionate kiss. The timestamp burned into the bottom corner showed it was taken on a Tuesday afternoon, exactly at the hour when Julian had claimed he was meeting a crucial structural engineer, and exactly when I was paying the monthly rent for Chloe's luxury apartment. However, the visual evidence was not the true killing blow. That devastating strike came in the form of an audio file attached to the very end of the digital report. Vance had managed to record a conversation Chloe had while day drinking with her opportunistic, shallow friends at a trendy rooftop bar. I clicked the play button, and the sound of my sister's shrill, arrogant laughter instantly filled the dead silence of my home office. "Oh, you guys have absolutely no idea," Chloe's voice crackled aggressively through the high-end speakers, slurring slightly from the expensive craft cocktails I had undoubtedly paid for. "Julian is entirely wrapped around my little finger. He is so incredibly tired of her. My sister is just a heartless banking machine to him at this point. She is so obsessed with her stupid financial spreadsheets that she does not even see what is happening right in front of her face. Once I secure the bag, I'm getting it all: the penthouse, the luxury cars, the prestigious architect husband, and her massive fortune. She is going to be left with absolutely nothing. Julian already knows all the legal loopholes to take half her company shares, and she completely deserves it for always acting like she is a queen looking down on me. I am going to take her crown." Hearing those exact words did not just break my heart. It completely incinerated my soul. I sat frozen in the suffocating darkness of my office, staring blankly at the glowing computer screen, and I allowed myself exactly one single night of weakness. For 8 agonizing hours, I wept uncontrollably. I cried for the entire decade I had wasted building a life with a man whose loyalty was as thin and fragile as wet paper. I cried for the younger sister I had fiercely protected, funded, and provided for, the exact same sister who was actively plotting my total financial and emotional destruction with a cocktail in her hand. I mourned the family I truly thought I had, the beautiful future I thought I was building, and the naive, trusting woman I used to be. The tears flowed heavily until my eyes burned fiercely and my throat was completely raw, mourning the painful death of my entire reality. But when the sun finally began to rise over the vast expanse of Lake Michigan, painting the morning sky in violent, bloody shades of orange and red, the mourning period officially ended. I wiped the final, stray tear from my cold cheek. I stood up, walked directly into the master bathroom, turned the heavy brass faucet, and splashed freezing water onto my face. The icy water dripped down my chin, washing away the last remaining fragments of the victimized wife. The woman looking back at me in the polished mirror was a different creature entirely. The profound heartbreak was completely gone, entirely replaced by a massive glacier of pure, calculating rage. My heart had completely turned to solid stone. Most women in my terrifying position would have immediately printed out those explicit photographs, stormed right into the master bedroom, and confronted their cheating husband. They would have thrown expensive designer clothes out the window onto the street, screamed until their voices gave out completely, and immediately filed for a messy, highly public divorce. But doing that would have given Julian and Chloe a desperate chance to spin the narrative. It would have given them valuable time to hide assets, play the tragic victims to our families, and drag me through agonizing years of exhausting legal battles. They wanted to steal my life, my hard-earned money, and my dignity. Instead of laying my cards on the table in a fit of emotional rage, I decided to build a financial slaughterhouse and gladly invite them inside. I would not just divorce Julian, I would absolutely annihilate him. I would not just cut Chloe off financially, I would make sure she never recovered from the fallout. I was going to meticulously design a perfect, inescapable trap. I would let them continue to firmly believe they were the smartest, most cunning people in the room, right up until the exact moment I securely locked the doors and burned their entire world to the ground. The game had fundamentally changed, and those two traitors were about to learn exactly why I was the most feared executive in the entire financial district. For the next several weeks, I became an Academy Award-winning actress in my own home. I continued to kiss Julian on the cheek every morning before work, ensuring my voice carried the exact same tone of affection it had for the past 7 years. I still invited Chloe over for Sunday dinners, praising her imaginary progress in finding a job while pouring her glasses of $200 wine when Julian complained about the stress of his architecture firm. I rubbed his shoulders and told him he was a misunderstood genius. When Chloe complained about the high cost of living in Chicago, I smiled and quietly transferred another $3,000 into her checking account. They foolishly mistook my compliance for ignorance. Every single smile was a highly calculated move, and every gentle touch was a lie, designed to keep them completely comfortable and utterly blind to the guillotine hanging directly over their necks. While they were busy sneaking around cheap motels, I was systematically dismantling our shared financial existence. I spent 70 to 80 hours a week locked in my corner office at Aetherius Capital. But I was not just managing client portfolios anymore. I was liquidating, transferring, and entirely shielding everything I had built over the last 12 years. Julian thought he knew the extent of my wealth, but he only saw the surface-level accounts. With the help of a ruthless offshore asset protection attorney, I quietly moved my 65% controlling stake in my investments into 3 blind, irrevocable trusts stationed in jurisdictions where Julian's divorce lawyers would never even get a subpoena answered. I siphoned millions of dollars in personal capital through a labyrinth of shell corporations, legally washing the funds until they vanished from the domestic grid. I left exactly enough in our joint domestic accounts to avoid triggering any automated banking alerts. A pathetic $5,000 to keep the illusion alive. I even refinanced the mortgage on our downtown penthouse, pulling out the massive equity and sinking it into an untouchable corporate entity, effectively leaving Julian half of a massive debt instead of a multi-million-dollar asset. By the time I was finished, his legally claimable portion of my empire was exactly 0. A public execution requires a proper audience, and I intended to pack the court with everyone who mattered. The upcoming anniversary party was the perfect theater. I took complete control of the guest list, framing it to Julian as my sweet way of taking the stress off his shoulders. I made sure to invite all 50 of his major real estate developers, the structural engineers who endorsed his projects, and the venture capitalists keeping his firm afloat. I sent premium, embossed invitations to the mayor's office and the heads of the zoning board. For Chloe, I ensured all her superficial, gossiping friends, the exact ones she had bragged to about stealing my life, received VIP passes. I wanted the people they needed most, the people whose opinions dictated their social and professional survival, to be sitting in the front row when the masks were finally ripped off. Exactly 48 hours before the grand event, my carefully orchestrated plan hit an unexpected acceleration. I was finalizing the catering menu when Vance Sterling requested an emergency meeting. We met in the back of his armored vehicle parked in a subterranean garage. He did not say a single word at first. He simply handed me a sealed medical folder. He had managed to track Chloe to a highly discreet private clinic on the north side of the city. She was indeed pregnant, just as she had drunkenly plotted. But Vance had pulled the covert genetic testing records, cross-referencing them with DNA samples he had lifted from Julian's discarded coffee cups. The results were staggering. The child growing inside my sister's womb had absolutely 0 genetic connection to my husband. Julian was not the father. He was just the pathetic, gullible backup plan for a colossal mistake she had made with someone else. As I read the true father's name on the clandestine lab report, a cold, terrifying laugh escaped my throat. The universe had not just handed me a weapon, it had handed me a tactical nuclear warhead. I immediately called the event coordinators at the five-star hotel and made several highly specific, last-minute adjustments. I demanded a massive, theater-sized projector screen be installed directly behind the main stage, disguised beneath heavy velvet curtains until the exact moment I needed it. I hired an independent audio-visual technician, paying him $10,000 in cash to bypass the hotel's network and hardwire his laptop directly to my encrypted server. I also had my legal team draft a mountain of terrifying documents including divorce papers, eviction notices, and corporate severance forms neatly organized in a thick black leather portfolio that Vance would carry. Everything was primed. The trap was set. The bait was taken. And the audience was gathering. When the night of the anniversary finally arrived, I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety or fear. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in our master suite, slipping into my emerald silk gown, and I felt nothing but cold, absolute power. Julian knocked on the door, dressed in his midnight blue tuxedo, wearing that practiced, charming smile that used to make my heart skip a beat. Now, it just looked like the face of a dead man walking. I took his arm, completely serene and steady. We walked out of the penthouse, stepped into the waiting limousine, and drove toward the downtown hotel. I walked into that glittering ballroom not as a heartbroken victim about to face the storm, but as a silent, untouchable queen who was about to unleash a hurricane upon the people who dared to think they could destroy me. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, ringing in my ears like the deafening aftermath of a massive explosion. 400 people were holding their collective breath, waiting for the hurricane to hit. Chloe was staring at me, her chest puffing with toxic pride, her hand resting performatively on her flat stomach. She expected a blood-curdling scream. She expected me to tear at my hair, to fall to my knees, to shatter into a million jagged pieces right in front of Chicago's elite. Instead, I simply reached out. My hand was perfectly steady as my fingers wrapped securely around the cold metal of the microphone. I gently pulled it from her unresisting grip. Her arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny flicker of confusion passing behind her eyes as she registered my completely serene smile. I did not look at Julian. I did not look at my horrified parents. I looked straight out into the sea of stunned faces. "Ladies and gentlemen," I spoke softly, but the amplified sound echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous room. "I want to sincerely thank my sister for that incredibly dramatic announcement. It actually provides the absolute perfect transition for the second part of this evening's presentation." I paused, letting the profound bewilderment wash over the massive crowd. "Vance, if you would be so kind." In the far back corner of the grand ballroom, completely swallowed by the shadows near the secondary exit doors, a man slowly stood up. The wealthy guests closest to him instinctively parted, their eyes tracking the imposing figure dressed in a sharp charcoal suit. Vance Sterling did not rush. He walked down the center aisle with the terrifying, measured pace of a professional executioner. His heavy footsteps on the hardwood floor seemed to perfectly echo the pounding heartbeats of the 400 guests. Julian finally found his voice, a pathetic, strangled squeak leaving his throat as he watched the stranger approach the stage. Vance climbed the velvet stairs, his face a chilling mask of absolute professional indifference. He walked directly to the podium, standing just a few feet away from my trembling husband and my suddenly rigid sister. With a resounding, heavy thud that made the entire front row physically flinch, Vance dropped a massive, black leather portfolio onto the polished mahogany surface. He did not say a single word. He simply gave me a brief, respectful nod, pulled a small remote from his pocket, and pressed a single button. Behind us, the heavy velvet curtains covering the back wall of the stage automatically parted with a low mechanical hum. A massive theater-sized projector screen slowly lowered from the ceiling. A second later, the independent technician I had hired activated the encrypted feed. The crystal chandeliers abruptly dimmed, plunging the opulent ballroom into a dramatic, theatrical twilight, instantly drawing every single eye to the glaring white light of the giant screen. The very first image was the high-resolution photograph from the cheap motel on Interstate 95. It was blown up to 20 feet tall, making it entirely impossible to miss the sickening details. There was Julian, wearing the custom-tailored suit I had bought him for his 36th birthday, aggressively pinning Chloe against the passenger side of his luxury sedan. The timestamp glowed brightly in the bottom corner. Tuesday, October 14th, at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, a collective, horrified gasp ripped through the ballroom. It sounded as if all 400 people had been simultaneously punched in the stomach, but the slideshow did not stop. It was ruthlessly programmed to advance every 7 seconds. Next came the banking statements. Huge, highlighted financial spreadsheets detailing Julian's secret cash withdrawals. $400 here, $800 there, paying for the squalid rooms where they conducted their filthy affair. Then came the text messages, projected in massive, undeniable fonts, explicit, graphic exchanges sent while Julian was sitting right next to me on our living room couch. Messages from Chloe viciously mocking my heavy work hours. Messages from Julian calling me a cold, unfeeling automatic teller machine. One specific slide featured a receipt for a $3,000 diamond tennis bracelet Julian had purchased with a hidden secondary credit card, displayed right alongside a photograph of Chloe proudly wearing that exact same bracelet at a charity gala I had entirely funded. The stunned silence in the room violently shattered. The chaotic murmuring swelled into a deafening roar of absolute outrage and disbelief. I watched the faces of Julian's most crucial business partners, Elias Thorne, his primary venture capitalist, slammed his champagne flute down onto a nearby table so hard the crystal stem snapped completely in half. His face was purple with pure, unadulterated rage. The mayor's chief of staff, who was supposed to officially approve Julian's latest zoning permits tomorrow morning, was furiously whispering into his phone, already executing desperate damage control to distance his office from the toxic fallout. The elite society wives, women who had smiled at Chloe just an hour ago, were openly pointing and sneering, their faces twisted in absolute disgust. The room had instantly transformed from a lavish celebration into a brutal tribunal of public execution. Julian completely broke under the crushing weight of the exposure. The charming, arrogant facade he had flawlessly maintained for a decade violently crumbled into dust. His knees simply gave out. He collapsed onto the floor of the stage, his expensive midnight blue tuxedo crumpling around him. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees like a desperate animal, reaching out with violently shaking fingers to grab the hem of my emerald silk gown. "Brooklyn, please," Julian sobbed hysterically, his voice cracking and breaking as heavy tears streamed down his ashen face. "Please, turn it off. I am so sorry. It meant nothing to me. I swear to you on my life, it meant absolutely nothing. I was just weak. She seduced me. She tricked me into this. I was under so much stress with the architecture firm, and you were always working. I just made a terrible, stupid mistake. Please, do not do this to me in front of everyone. I love you. You are my wife." He was groveling like a beaten dog, desperately trying to shift the blame, entirely ignoring the fact that his terrible, stupid mistake had lasted for over 6 months. I did not move a single inch. I simply stared down at him with eyes as cold and dead as a frozen lake, letting him choke on his own pathetic tears while his wealthiest investors watched his total lack of dignity. Seeing Julian instantly turn on her in front of the entire city's elite broke whatever fragile grip Chloe had left on reality. She realized in a horrifying flash that she was not the victorious mistress conquering the queen. She was the absolute villain of the century, and the vicious crowd was ready to tear her apart. Her face turned an ugly mottled shade of crimson. She stomped her high heel furiously against the wooden stage, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical screech that violently cut through the angry murmurs of the crowd. "Stop looking at me like that!" Chloe screamed at the audience, pointing her trembling finger wildly at the front row where our parents stood weeping in sheer terror and shame. She then turned her venom toward Julian, who was still pathetic and weeping on the floor. "You cowardly piece of garbage! How dare you blame this on me? You told me you loved me. You told me you were going to leave her." She then whipped around to face me, her eyes completely unhinged, clinging desperately to her one remaining weapon. She grabbed her stomach with both hands, using her unborn child as a literal human shield against the crushing judgment of the room. "It does not matter what you show them on that giant screen," Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing wildly through the microphone I still held near her. "You can show all the pictures and receipts you want. Brooklyn, it does not change the physical reality. I am having his baby. I am carrying Julian's blood. He is the father of my child, and he has a legal and moral responsibility to me. You cannot erase that. You have lost him, and you cannot undo this baby." She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving, staring at me with a desperate, wild defiance, eagerly waiting for me to finally break down and acknowledge her ultimate victory card. But she was severely mistaken. The game was not over. In fact, the final, lethal move was just about to be played. "You are carrying a child, Chloe," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the thick, suffocating tension in the massive room. "That much is entirely true, but you really should have paid much closer attention to biology before you decided to declare war on me." I did not break eye contact with my sister. I simply raised my left hand and gave Vance Sterling a subtle, deliberate nod. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom deepened, becoming almost physically crushing as Vance calmly reached out and turned to the absolute final page of his thick leather portfolio. He pressed the small button on his remote one last time. The giant screen behind us flickered brightly. The humiliating text messages and sordid hotel receipts vanished, completely replaced by a stark, clinical document. It was a highly confidential DNA paternity report from one of the most exclusive private medical clinics located in the wealthy northern suburbs of the city. The massive black letters on the glowing white background were completely impossible for anyone to misinterpret. "Probability of paternity for Julian Harper." I read the text aloud, my voice steady and perfectly clear for all 400 guests to hear. 0%. Chloe's face completely drained of color. Her hands, which had been protectively clutching her stomach just moments before, fell limply to her sides. She looked like she had just been struck by a massive freight train. Julian, still kneeling pathetically on the hardwood floor, stared up at the giant screen in sheer, uncomprehending horror. His brain violently struggled to process the monumental, life-ending betrayal. He had foolishly thrown away a decade of stable marriage, his impeccable professional reputation, and his personal dignity for a woman who was actively deceiving him about the very child she used to secure his blind commitment. He was the ultimate fool. "Wait," Julian gasped, his voice a pathetic, broken wheeze as he looked from the screen to Chloe. "If it is not mine, then whose is it?" "I am so glad you asked, Julian," I replied smoothly, a cold smile touching my lips. I nodded at Vance again. The slide transitioned flawlessly. The new image was not a clandestine motel shot. It was a crystal-clear security photograph taken from the private elevator of a luxury condominium downtown. It showed Chloe wrapped intimately in the arms of an older, distinguished man. The man whose face was now projected 20 feet high for all of Chicago high society to witness. "Allow me to introduce the real father," I announced, gesturing gracefully toward the glowing screen. "Elias Thorne, 60 years old, your primary venture capitalist, the man holding the financial strings to your entire architecture firm." The collective gasp that ripped through the ballroom this time was entirely deafening. All eyes instantly snapped toward the front row, where Elias Thorne had been standing. He was completely paralyzed, his face sweating profusely under the dim lights. Next to him stood his wife, Margaret Thorne, a formidable woman who came from old money and wielded more social and financial power than anyone else in the room. For a terrifying 5 seconds, nobody moved. Then, Margaret Thorne turned slowly to her husband. She drew her hand back and delivered a resounding, vicious slap directly across Elias's face. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the silent room. "You disgusting, pathetic pig," Margaret hissed, her voice dripping with absolute venom. She did not yell. She did not need to. Her quiet fury was terrifying. "You sleep with this cheap trash, and you use our family money to fund her lover's failing architecture firm? Consider your personal assets completely frozen, Elias. And as for you, Julian Harper, my family is pulling every single cent of capital out of your fraudulent company effective immediately. You are entirely bankrupt as of tonight." Julian let out a terrible howl of pure agony. The realization hit him with the force of a wrecking ball. He had betrayed the only woman who ever truly supported him, only to be utterly destroyed by his own mistress and his biggest financial backer. He was not just losing a wife, he was losing his business, his wealth, and his entire future in one single night. Chloe desperately tried to run off the stage, but she was met by the furious, crying faces of our parents. My mother, shaking with uncontrollable rage and profound disappointment, raised her hand to stop Chloe from stepping any closer. "Do not ever call us again," my mother wept, her voice breaking with the ultimate rejection. "You are no daughter of ours. You are a vile, manipulative monster, and you are entirely dead to this family." Julian's parents turned their backs completely, refusing to even look at the disgraced son kneeling in the center of his own destruction. The chaos around me was absolute, but I felt nothing but a profound, cleansing peace. The cancer had been entirely excised from my life. I unclasped the small evening bag I held in my hand and pulled out a thick stack of legally binding documents. I tossed the already signed divorce papers directly into Julian's weeping face. The heavy papers fluttered down, scattering across the polished wooden floor around his knees. "Keep the ring, Julian," I said coldly, looking down at him one final time. "Consider it my final charity donation." I turned my back on the pathetic wailing. I did not look back at my sister, whose delusions of grandeur had just shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I simply walked down the stage stairs, my head held incredibly high. Vance Sterling stepped perfectly into stride beside me, a silent, imposing guardian parting the sea of stunned, whispering guests. The heavy double doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and I stepped out into the cool, crisp Chicago night air, completely free, leaving the two traitors to drown in the magnificent ruins of their own miserable lives. Thank you so much to all of you wonderful listeners for tuning in to Violet Revenge Stories today. Please let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. If you enjoyed this story of absolute karma, please kindly help our channel by donating just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the description or the comments section below. Your incredible generosity allows us to pay our hardworking staff so they can feed their families and continue creating these amazing stories for you. Have a wonderful day, and stay strong.